What's going on, family? I'm Scrapbook Boxing. The Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuff series will continue its conversation with you concerning the complete history of boxing. In our last video, we talked about the great Henry Armstrongs to your right. And at an earlier video, we talked about the great Joseph Louis Barrow, who's located on your left. Why were both these men's careers so significant? Not only to the game of pugilism, but to the African American community as well. And it came at a perfect time. Both these men would become champion in 1937. But they didn't stop there. Let's break down this information a little further. October 29, 1937, Henry Armstrong was the California Mexican featherweight champion coming into this fight with Petey Cerrone. It would be for the NBA and the New York SAC featherweight championship title. Henry Armstrong would stop Petey Cerrone in 6 rounds. This was a milestone if I've ever heard one, because you never had a black featherweight champion from America until Henry Armstrong would defeat Petey Cerrone. Let's keep that in context. This is very, very important. George Dixon would become the featherweight champion, the first black fighter to ever accomplish that feat, but he was from Canada. Just as important, but we have to separate the difference between both men. Not only was he the first black featherweight champion, and he was from Canada, but George Dixon would engage in the most championship title fights up until that point. 34 championship title fights. He would win the bantamweight title twice. He defended it twice, but he would win the featherweight championship title 3 times, challenged it once, and defended it 25 times. George Dixon would equal the title defenses in his featherweight championship reign, as Joseph Louis Barrow did in his heavyweight championship reign. Now, the difference between Henry Armstrong and George Dixon was that Henry Armstrong was living in a country that didn't allow him that opportunity. And Henry Armstrong finally got his shot, October 29, 1937, and he would become the first black American featherweight champion in boxing history. Not only was he the first black American featherweight champion in boxing history, but he would become the second black fighter to win the world title in New York's Madison Square Garden. Which parallel to that, George Dixon was the first black fighter to fight in Madison Square Garden in 1870. And Henry Armstrong would be the second black American fighter to win a world title. The first one was Theodore Tiger Flowers, 1926, against Henry Greb. He was a middleweight. Henry Armstrong was a featherweight. Henry Armstrong was the first black featherweight champion in any country, any peninsula, to win that title. You need to really grasp that information, because when Henry Armstrong came up in the ranks, black fighters didn't or were not afforded that opportunity. It wasn't heard of. So he would hold that featherweight championship title in 1937. Meanwhile, Joseph Louis Barrow would become the second black heavyweight champion when he would defeat Jimmy Braddock in Comiskey Park in Chicago, Illinois. Do you understand how significant that was? The last heavyweight champion you had was Jack Johnson as a black fighter. He won that title in 1908 over Noah Brusso of Canada. Noah Brusso, as we know, is Tommy Burns. Tommy Burns would set a record at that point of the most title defenses as a heavyweight champion, 8. Jack Johnson would lose his title in 1915 in 26 rounds to Jess Willard. There was a lot of controversy. We already went over that. But you didn't have another black heavyweight champion until Joseph Louis Barrow would knock out James J. Braddock. And he would become the first black heavyweight champion since Jack Johnson at a time when this country needed it the most and the African American community needed that moment specifically based on what was going on in their lives. They didn't have a hero. They didn't have anyone to look up to. The mothers could not mention their boys to someone that they could look up to. They couldn't mention the girls of a man of that stature with that platform of how to behave himself. On that platform, I want to be clear. So Joe Louis played many roles. He had and wore many hats. So it was so important that Joe Louis deliver for the African American community. Why was Henry Armstrong so significant? Because now you had a black heavyweight and you needed a small man who was black to kind of sandwich in the monopoly, if you will. So Henry Armstrong went further. Recognizing that, he would challenge the welterweight champion, Barney Ross, at the New York Madison Square Garden Bowl a few months later. And he would defeat Barney Ross in 15 rounds, very hard-fought rounds. He would carry Barney Ross. He didn't want to knock him out because Barney Ross was his stablemate. They both had a manager named Eddie Mead. So as if Joseph Louis would defeat Jimmy Braddock, he would become a household name. The parades that Joseph Louis Barrow would engage in, the nightclubs, he was invited to everything. Everyone looked up to Joe Louis, but Henry Armstrong didn't really have that kind of support. So he targeted one more weight division, and that would be the lightweight division, because he tried to go after the lightweight champion at that time, who was Lou Ambers. But Lou Ambers stated that he had other engagements, but he didn't want to challenge Henry Armstrong at that time. He was hoping he got picked off. He never did. So he became somewhat of a mandatory, if you will, not as a lightweight contender, but of what the world was looking for during that time. Because Henry Armstrong now started becoming a household name. So why this is important? What am I saying? You have Joe Louis, who was the heavyweight champion of the world. John Henry Lewis, who was the current light heavyweight champion in 1937 because he would defeat Bob Olin in 1935. Bob Olin really started picking up boxing in 1929 when he worked as a stockbroker on Wall Street. And once the stock market crashed in 29, a lot of jobs were lost. And Bob Olin picked up the fight game. He would eventually become the light heavyweight champion. So in 35, John Henry Lewis would take on Bob Olin, and he would become the second black light heavyweight champion, but the first black American light heavyweight champion in boxing history. This was significant. Hear me, this was significant. Because now you had the first black American featherweight champion in Henry Armstrong, the first black American light heavyweight champion in John Henry Lewis. And you had the second black American heavyweight champion, Joe Louis. So now you had a featherweight, a heavyweight, and a light heavyweight. But let's keep in mind, Henry Armstrong would defeat Barney Ross, so he would become the welterweight champion, only the second man to do it. He was the first American black welterweight champion. So Henry Armstrong would become the fourth black welterweight champion, but he was only the second man to make the accomplishment that he made. He came up from featherweight to go to welterweight to accomplish that feat. Oh. Oh. I don't think you understand. I don't know. This is crazy. No other fighter has ever done that. Any weight, any race, any country, peninsula, didn't happen. From 124 to 147, it didn't happen. Now, Bob Fitzsimmons was a middleweight, but he weighed 168 when he moved up to the heavyweight division to take on the Boilermaker Jim Jeffries. And he did come back down to the light heavyweight division, as Henry Armstrong would come back down from welterweight to lightweight. But Henry Armstrong held all three titles simultaneously. No man has ever done this. And in 1938, you would now have a black fighter who was the featherweight champion, a black fighter who was the lightweight champion, a black fighter who was the welterweight champion, a black fighter who was the light heavyweight champion, and a black fighter who was the world heavyweight champion. That has never happened. That was the first time. This was important. It was extremely important. Henry Armstrong accomplished that feat in 10 months. Joe Louis had a score to settle with Max Schmeling of Germany. Why he was important was because America had a quarrel with Japan, and it was an issue with Germany. Because after Joe Louis was knocked out in the 12th round by Max Schmeling in New York's Yankee Stadium in 1936, Max Schmeling would be flown back to Germany on a Hindenburg. He was celebrated. That same year, you had the Olympic Games in Berlin. Jesse Owens and others would dominate the race. Jesse Owens won 4 gold medals. Adolf Hitler was sitting in the throne watching this happen. So more pressure was now placed on Max Schmeling because the Aryan race, the supreme race, the supreme country was at stake. And these two men were pawns, Max Schmeling and Joe Louis. Where Henry Armstrong would come into play. He would defend his title against Ernie Rudrick of England, and he would defeat Ernie Rudrick. That was a big deal, and that's not talked about as much as it should be. But with Joe Louis, the entire country's eyeballs were looking down on Joe Louis and Max Schmeling. Max Schmeling all of a sudden became a household name. He already did his thing in 1930, in 1931. but he had a second chance because he was supposed to get that shot with Jim Braddock. But Jim Braddock left Max Schmeling on the scales by himself because Jimmy Braddock was not allowed to face Max Schmeling. Everyone knew Max Schmeling could possibly defeat Jimmy Braddock. What stopped that fight initially was Joe Gould, who was the manager of James Braddock. He made a set of rules to face Max Schmeling that Germany release every Jew from the concentration camps. And if they would do that, they would get a title, shot opportunity. And they refused it. So Joe Gould decided to sit back on his laurels, smoking a cigar. And the next opportunity would be Joe Louis, because they knew Joe Louis could defeat Max Schmeling, although Max Schmeling defeated Joe Louis in 36. But they also saw money and they saw rulership. So they were willing to gamble. Joe Gould wouldn't budge. The only way that we can get that to happen was that Joe Louis had to give up 10% of every paycheck that he would receive. For the next 10 years would wind up being his entire career. Joe Louis wanted a title shot, but he wanted revenge with Max Schmeling. So you got the best of both worlds through Joe Louis. The country would have rulership, because at that time, you have to understand, the heavyweight division was the king. The first champion of America who showed domination was the bare-knuckle American champion, John L. Sullivan. John O'Sullivan would become champion February 7th, 1882, when he would defeat Paddy Ryan. He defeated Paddy Ryan, I believe it was 8 rounds. Now, when he defeated Paddy Ryan defeated Joe Gauss. John O'Sullivan was supposed to take on Joe Gauss the same way he was supposed to take on Jake Courain in 1887, but he didn't have the backing, the financial backing, to take on that fight. So he didn't fight him until 1889, and that was a 3.5-hour contest, lasted 70 plus rounds. But Joe Louis would knock out Max Schmeling in 1 round. What was very significant about that moment, and I talked about this, Arthur Donovan was called to the New York State Athletic Commission. This has never happened. In orders of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was told on the phone, you don't stop the fight until a man is counted out. And it was that, well, what if, and he was cut off immediately by FDR. I don't give a damn. I'm telling you, you don't stop the damn fight until the man is completely out cold. You not count to 10, you count to 12. Make sure that man don't move a muscle. Because I cannot afford a war on my watch. If you stop the fight too soon for Joe Louis, we can have another red summer. That happened when Joe Louis was a little boy. Jack Johnson had knocked out James J. Jeffries, and the country went haywire. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt was in a tough spot. He wanted to make sure no fighter was counted out until they were completely out. And that's the reason why 1 minute and 38 seconds. When Donovan was about to count out Max Schmeling, Max Miloff did not want Max Schmeling counted out. So he threw in the towel, stopping the contest. Arthur Donovan took the towel and threw it out because he wanted that man out cold before he stopped the contest. He didn't want any controversy. He didn't want any mob connection ties or anything like that. He wanted the man out because that's the orders he was given. You got to remember, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Adolf Hitler both took office in 1933. Hitler became the Fuhrer in 1934. And after this was done, both men died in 1945. It was though both these men's mission was complete. And Joe Louis and Max Schmeling will remain friends forever. Henry Armstrong would go on to rule the welterweight division, having 19 title defenses. I mentioned 1937, he would become the featherweight champion of the world. Well, he would be a man with 27 fights, no losses with 26 knockouts. I mentioned the only man who didn't be knocked out by Henry Armstrong was Aldi Spoldi. I mentioned Edwin Valero, who was a Mexican fighter, had a record of 27-0 with 27 knockouts. Took him 8 years to accomplish that. Henry Armstrong basically accomplished that in 1 year. But did I mention to you in 1939, he would defend his welterweight championship title 5 times in the month of October that same year in 1938? Did I mention to you Henry Armstrong could not change in a locker room, although he was the world champion? He had to change in mop closets. He used to shadow box 15 rounds before coming out of his locker room. He got that from George Dixon, who discovered shadowboxing. You see, Henry Armstrong was a remarkable fighter. I'm going to show you the scrapbooks between Henry Armstrong and Joe Louis, their magnificent moments in the ring. Now, I want to first show you Nazi denies faking Louis fight films. What are they talking about? When Max Schmeling was knocked out, they cut off the broadcast in Germany so that the members of Germany wouldn't know exactly what happened at the end of that fight. So when they did that, in Germany, they stated that Max Schmeling won, and they were given all types of allegations as to what took place. And they did something with the fight films. They hid them for a while. And they had a little bit of a hearing, if you will. And it was a denial that anything was tampered with the fight films. So I just wanted to show you that. Now, I'll go through this with you another time. There's Henry and Harry. There were 2 half-brothers, Henry Armstrong and Henry Jackson and Harry Armstrong. But this is what I want to show you. Sports of the time. We're going into the Henry Armstrong and Lou Amber's fight. And this would seal the deal of Henry Armstrong's accomplishment. when Henry Armstrong would become the only man to hold all three titles simultaneously. This was a remarkable, remarkable feat. The triple threat. And they really didn't want this to happen. They didn't want Henry Armstrong accomplishing this. They didn't think he could actually do it. They didn't think he could pull that off. But he turned out to accomplish that. And it happened the same year Joe Louis was heavyweight champion. John Henry Lewis was light heavyweight champion. And Henry Armstrong would have 3 titles. The only thing that was missing was the middleweight championship title. And Henry tried to go up in 1940 to accomplish that, but they made sure that didn't happen. And we'll talk about that another time when we get to 1940. Barney Ross and Henry Armstrong will box tonight. 40,000 are expected to see, twice postponed by the former welterweight champion. Notable to be presented. 1-2 favorite at the Madison Square Garden Bowl. You have Henry Armstrong and Barney Ross. Trying to focus this here for you. It's one of the problems I have in trying to show you these scrapbooks from time to time. Now, we've been looking at the Henry Armstrong scrapbook. I have 3 scrapbooks of Henry Armstrong, 1,000 each, 2,000 front and back, 6,000 pages of Henry Armstrong's information. All of the original articles, Armstrong and Ambers. Henry Armstrong was 25 years old. Lou Ambers was 24 years old. Lou Ambers was a cousin of Marty Servo, who was a welterweight champion. And Servo never gave Sugar Ray Robinson an opportunity. That's another story. But it was some night when Henry Armstrong would defeat Lou Ambers. He swallowed so much blood. And the referee was going to stop the contest because there was a lot of blood on the floor. And Henry Armstrong pleaded with him and said, I will not allow any more blood to come out of my mouth. And he would swallow the rest of the blood. And he wound up getting a stomach ulcer. And that was another issue in Henry Armstrong's life. But he finished that fight and he would become the lightweight champion of the world. What a remarkable fighter this man was. Now, Chalky Wright was another protege of Eddie Meade. He had managed Chalky Wright. Chalky Wright would defeat Joey Archibald for the featherweight championship title. And then, of course, Willie Pep would defeat Chalky Wright for his crown. So I'm just browsing around here just to give you some idea of what some of these articles look like. Once again, Lou Ambers, 24 years old. Henry Armstrong was 25 years old. And you can see the difference in reach and height. And these are various articles of their fight. I'm not going to read too much. I'm just going to scan this for you, just so you can get an idea of what was said in some of these articles. All right, so let's take a look at the Joe Louis scrapbook with Joe Louis and Max Schmeling. Now, that scrapbook is all Joe Louis and Max Schmeling. I have 5 Joe Louis scrapbook, but 1 scrapbook with Joe Louis and Max Schmeling by itself. First and second fight, 1,000 pages, 2,000 front and back. Just Joe Louis and Max Schmeling alone. Let's finish this off and we'll take a look at that scrapbook. There's so much to uncover here. All right, let's take a look at, hold on one second. Let's take a look at One more page here. I know I'm scanning this. I want to get to the next book with Joe Lewis and Max Schmeling. All right, I'm sorry. I'm going to have to do a part two. I'm running out of room here. So I'll do a part two with Joe Lewis and Max Schmeling. But it's a scrapbook boxing museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series. All great fights, all great fighters will never be forgotten on my channel. We will continue with the Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series, the complete history of boxing. Be well. Peace. Donovan flicks towel, then steps in. Amazing. I will pick it up in the next conversation. Thanks for watching. Peace.